Now, to understand more deeply China's history, we should also think about the phases of China's history. In Chinese historiography, the dynasties of China, because China conventionally is dated by historians depending on the political rule of the country. And that political rule tells us a lot about history, and of course the Great Wall of China fits in deeply into that cycle of rule. Think about 4 different kinds of rule or governance in China. One kind of governance is, as in today's China, a large unitary state, relatively safe on all its borders, and typically a kind of golden age or period of prosperity where China is unified and where China is safe along its boundaries. A second kind of period is a period where China is politically unified but fragile because it is vulnerable to external attack. What kind of external attack? Well, throughout most of China's history, external attack from the north, from the dryland regions, whether desert or steppe regions, and especially horse-based societies coming in to invade the sedentary farm societies of the more humid, temperate regions of China. There is a third kind of governance of China, and that is the periods when China was not only attacked from outside, but effectively ruled from outside, where China lost its sovereignty to outside powers. And that occurred twice from the north. It occurred once from the eastern seaboard. And the fourth kind of governance in China has been the periods in which China did not have a unitary state, but was divided into separate kingdoms or principalities or feuding states. The warring periods in China, the periods in which there is internal conflict, often periods where there is both internal conflict and external conflict, or where the external pressures led to the disintegration of the state. What's remarkable about China's history, its long history over more than 3,000 years, is the long periods in which China had a large and relatively stable and relatively safe unitary state or unified state. So of those 4 categories, of the categories of the safe unitary state, the state threatened from outside, the state conquered by outside powers, and the disintegration of unitary power, China's history is blessed with long periods of unitary rule, relatively, though never perfectly safe, from external threat. And that has marked China's statecraft now for more than 2,000 years. And again, the Great Wall plays an important part of that story. If we go back 3,000 years, in fact, maybe 3,500 years to around 1,500 BCE, we have the first relatively large political unit of China, the ancient Zhang dynasty, from around 1500 BCE to around 1000 BCE. It's not really a unitary state, and it is only a modest part of modern China, but it was the first confederation, as it were, under one sense of unified political rule. But even then, China and the many parts and kingdoms that were part of what is today's modern Chinese geography were warring with each other and also facing constant threats from the north, from the steppelands, and from the Xiongnu peoples, the pastoralist nomadic peoples who are considered to be the proto-Mongolian populations and the proto-Turkic populations of the steppeland regions. In other words, the Xiongnu populations, the pastoralists in the north, were the early progenitors of what would later be Mongolian and Turkic invaders that would threaten China from the northern drylands. Following the earliest dynasty is the Zhou dynasty, which is dated by historians approximately from 1000 BCE to about 250 BCE. And though there was nominally a unitary state, it was in fact a state that had tremendous contention and a lot of warfare among smaller kingdoms. And indeed, of the 750 years of the Zhou dynastic period, that 750 years is itself divided into two phases. The first, the spring and the autumn period, roughly the first 250 years, and then a second period called the Warring States period, whose name tells a lot. The period roughly from 750 BCE to around 250 BCE. The Warring States period is just what we hear, a period in which there was a Zhou dynasty, but within it many, many warring states. And that is the period in which Confucius lived. And Confucius went from state to state trying to convince the state leaders of the need for virtuous leadership and for creating the conditions for peace. He was not so successful in the practical policy recommendations of his day, but he was successful in imparting an ideal which became core to China's culture and China's ideals of the right kind of virtuous society for the following 2,500 years. Now, after the Zhou dynastic period, China was finally unified, and unified for the first time between the North China Plain and the Yangtze River Basin in the Qin dynasty. And we remember the Qin dynasty as being the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, who is called himself the first emperor of a unified Chinese state. Now, the Emperor Qin built part of this wall because in that period there was considerable, constant threat and pressure from the semi-nomadic or nomadic pastoralist communities of the north, the horse-based societies of the Xiongnu and their later descendants, Turkic populations, and especially the Mongolian-speaking populations. So Emperor Qin constructed more of a wall that had already been begun during the Warring States period. Emperor Qin is remembered both as the first emperor and as an authoritarian emperor, and his empire lasted just a few years until came the Han Empire.